Joanna grew up in a family where gestures spoke louder than words. Her mother, Helena, was a practical woman who believed that problems should be solved with hard work, not conversation. And her grandmother, Elisa, carried a disquieting serenity, as if she knew something that could never be said. Now at 32 years old, Joanna felt the impact of that silence in her own life. She was successful at work and had close friends, but something always made her feel disconnected from her emotions. It all began on a weekend at her mother's house. Helena was cleaning the attic when she called Joanna to help. "Can you take these boxes to the basement?" she asked, pointing to a pile of old objects. While carrying the boxes, Joanna noticed one of them, smaller and more worn, with the name Elisa handwritten on the lid. "Mom, what's this?" Joanna asked, holding the box. Helena glanced at it quickly and shrugged. "It's just one of your grandmother's things. Leave it there. There's nothing important." But there was something in Helena's tone of voice that sparked Joanna's curiosity. When her mother left the attic, Joanna opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of letters, old photos, and a journal. She picked up the journal and read the first page. "Some truths need to remain hidden, but my heart demands that I record them here. For myself, or for whoever comes after me." The mystery in those words made Joanna's heart race. Later that night, Joanna tried to talk to her mother about what she had found. "Mom, I opened Grandma's box. Did you know she had a journal?" Helena, who was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, stopped abruptly. "You shouldn't have touched that, Joanna." "Why not? What's so secret about it?" Joanna asked, feeling the tension grow. "There are things that belong to the past, Joanna. We don't need to bring them into the present," Helena said, returning to chopping the vegetables with more force than necessary. "But Mom, I feel like there's something in there that still affects us today. You never talk about Grandma, and she was such an important person in your life." Helena sighed, exhausted. "Let it go, Joanna. Some pains don't need to be stirred up." Joanna realized that insisting would be pointless, but she decided not to let the matter drop there. Back at her apartment, Joanna began reading her grandmother's journal. The first pages were full of details about Elisa's daily routine, but as she read further, Joanna noticed a shift in tone. "There are days when I feel like I'm carrying the weight of two lives. What happened that night will never leave me. I try to move forward, but some memories cannot be buried." Joanna was intrigued. What night was this? And what had happened to leave her grandmother so scarred? As she read, Joanna began to feel that this secret was not just her grandmother's, but something that impacted the entire family. Joanna scheduled a session with Anna, a therapist recommended by a friend. During their first conversation, she spoke about what she had found and how it made her feel disconnected from her own story. "I feel like my family is carrying something no one wants to talk about, and I don't know how, but I feel like it affects me too." Anna listened carefully before suggesting a family constellation. "Joanna, we often carry the secrets and pain of our ancestors without even realizing it. Let's explore this together." On the board, Anna positioned pieces representing Joanna, her mother, and her grandmother. "What do you feel when you look at this?" Anna asked. "I feel a distance, like something is missing between my mother and my grandmother." Anna added another piece, representing the secret that seemed to be at the center of it all. "And now, it feels like there's a barrier between them, as if something is holding my mother back and preventing her from connecting with me as well." Joanna felt tears well up as she spoke, but she also felt something else, a deep desire to understand and heal what had been hidden. Elisa's journal lay open on Joanna's table, halfway through. Her grandmother's handwriting seemed to change as the pages went on, becoming more hesitant, as if writing had become increasingly difficult. Joanna had spent the night reading, but the more she read, the more questions arose. Who was her grandmother, really? And why did her mother refuse to talk about the past? Joanna returned to one of the most cryptic pages in the journal. I promised I would never speak about that night, but the silence grows heavier each day. Helena would never understand why I made certain decisions. Maybe I don't fully understand them myself. I only hope that one day she can forgive me. Joanna felt her heart tighten. What could Elisa have done to feel she needed forgiveness? The next morning, Joanna returned to her mother's house with the journal in her bag. Helena was in the kitchen making coffee when her daughter entered. "Mom, we need to talk," Joanna began, trying to sound calm. Helena looked at her suspiciously. "About what?" "About Grandma. I read more of the journal, and there's something in there that seems very important. Do you know what she was talking about when she wrote about that night?" Helena froze, as if the words had struck her. "You shouldn't have gone through that, Joanna." "Why not?" "It's our history, Mom. And from what I've read, it seems to affect you much more than you want to admit." Helena set down the coffee spoon and turned to her daughter, her voice firm. "I already told you that some things need to stay in the past. You don't know what you're digging up. Then tell me," Joanna pleaded. "Help me understand why this is so hard for you. Maybe it's the only way for us to move forward." Helena hesitated for a long moment, but shook her head. "Not now, Joanna. I'm not ready for this." Joanna felt her frustration grow, but decided not to push further. As she left her mother's house, Joanna ran into her Uncle Jorge, Helena's brother, arriving for a visit. "Joanna, it's been so long," Jorge said, his voice warm and cheerful. "Uncle Jorge, it's so good to see you. Actually, I think you might be able to help me with something." "Of course, what is it?" Joanna hesitated before continuing. "I found Grandma's journal. There are things in there that, well, they seem important. Mom doesn't want to talk about it, but maybe you know something." Jorge's smile faded. He was silent for a few seconds before replying. "Your mother never liked to talk about the past, but I think she carries it more heavily than the rest of us." "Carries what exactly?" Joanna asked, anxious. Jorge sighed. "There was a night many years ago. Something happened between your grandmother and a close family friend. I don't know the details, but I know it changed everything. Your mother always thought Grandma was hiding something from her." Joanna felt a chill run through her. "A friend? Who was he?" "A man named Armando," Jorge replied. "He was very close to our family, but after that night, he never showed up again." Back at the therapist's office, Joanna told Anna what she had discovered. "I feel like my mother is carrying something that doesn't belong to her, but affects her deeply. And somehow, it's been passed on to me too." Anna listened carefully before rearranging the pieces on the board. "I want you to look at this piece," she said, placing one to represent Armando between Elisa and Helena. Joanna studied the configuration and felt her body tense. "It looks like he's between them, as if he's a barrier." "And what do you feel looking at this?" Anna asked. "I feel guilt, but it's not mine. It's like something that got stuck in my mother, and maybe even in my grandmother." Anna moved Joanna's piece closer to Helena. "And what would you like to say to your mother?" Joanna took a deep breath before responding. "I see that you're carrying something that isn't yours, and I want to help you let go of it." Back at her apartment, Joanna revisited her grandmother's journal, this time searching for any mention of Armando. It was in the final pages that she found a passage that made her heart race. "Armando was always a loyal friend, but that night, everything changed. He asked me to keep a secret that shouldn't have been mine. I agreed because I thought I was protecting my family. But in the end, I think I broke something between me and Helena. I hope she never discovers what happened." Joanna closed the journal, feeling the weight of those words. What had Elisa hidden? And why did she believe it had broken something with Helena? She knew that the only way to find out would be to confront her mother again, this time with more care. Joanna couldn't shake the thoughts of what she had read in the journal. Her grandmother's words, the mention of Armando, and the confession that the secret had affected Elisa and Helena's relationship. All of it left her restless. But as she tried to piece her thoughts together, her relationship with her mother grew increasingly strained. Helena seemed even more closed off since their last conversation, as if she knew Joanna was getting too close to something she didn't want to face. One late afternoon, Joanna returned to her mother's house, determined to try once more. She found Helena in the garden, watering the plants with a distant expression. "Mom, we need to talk," Joanna said, approaching her. "If this is about the journal, Joanna, I already told you I don't want to talk about it," Helena replied, without looking at her daughter. "But don't you think you've carried this weight for long enough? I read the last pages. Grandma talks about Armando and a secret she kept. She believed it hurt you, Mom. Don't you think it's time to understand what really happened?" Helena finally raised her eyes to Joanna, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of giving in. But then she shook her head defensively. "You don't understand, Joanna. Some things are meant to stay buried. Knowing the truth won't change anything." "Yes, it will," Joanna insisted. "It will help us understand why you and Grandma were always so distant. It will help us connect in a way we've never managed before." Joanna's words finally seemed to break something in Helena. She dropped the watering can and sat on the garden bench, covering her face with her hands. "I always thought my mother chose Armando over me," Helena confessed, her voice trembling. "I never knew exactly what happened, but I felt that he knew something I never did, and it made me feel excluded." Joanna sat beside her mother, holding her hand. "Mom, maybe what you imagine isn't what really happened, but we'll only find out if we face it together." That night, Helena finally began talking about her memories of Armando. "He was a kind man, always present. I saw him as a sort of uncle, someone who helped my mother around the house after my father died. But one day, when I was about 12, they had a terrible fight. I remember hearing my mother cry, and after that he never came back." "And you never asked Grandma what happened?" Joanna asked. "I asked once," Helena replied, "but she said it was better if I didn't know. After that, she would get angry whenever I mentioned his name." Joanna felt the weight of her grandmother's silence overlap with her mother's. It was as if the two of them were trapped in a web of hurt and mysteries they couldn't untangle. At the therapist's office, Joanna told Anna about her conversation with Helena. "I feel like my mother is starting to open up, but there's still so much we don't know. It's like the secret is at the center of everything, holding each of us in a different place." Anna rearranged the pieces on the board, placing Elisa, Helena, and Armando in a triangle, with Joanna close to Helena. "And what do you feel looking at this configuration?" Anna asked. "I feel like my mother is stuck between my grandmother and this secret, and somehow, it keeps her from fully connecting with me." Anna moved Joanna's piece closer to Helena. "And what would you like to say to your mother now?" "I'd like to say that she doesn't need to carry this alone, that I'm here to help." Anna smiled, moving Helena's piece closer to Joanna's. Maybe it's time to show her that. Back at her apartment, Joanna decided to explore the papers in her grandmother's box more thoroughly. That's when she found a sealed letter addressed to Helena, but never sent. Joanna carefully opened the envelope and read, "Helena, if you are reading this, it means I couldn't find the courage to speak to you in life. I want you to know that what happened with Armando was not your fault, nor his. He asked me to keep a secret that involved someone else, but in doing so, I ended up pushing you away from me. You have always been my light, and I hope that one day you can understand that everything I did was out of love. With all my heart, your mother." Joanna felt tears stream down her face as she read. The letter seemed to raise even more questions than answers, but it also made it clear that Elisa had kept the secret with the best intentions. The next day, Joanna took the letter to her mother. "Mom, I found this in Grandma's box. I think you need to read it." Helena took the envelope with trembling hands and read the letter in silence. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face. "She knew how much this hurt me," Helena whispered, "but she could never tell me." "Maybe she didn't know how," Joanna said. "But now you know that she never wanted to hurt you, and that the secret wasn't about you." Helena nodded, as if something inside her had finally loosened. "You're right, Joanna. Maybe it's time to let this go." That night, As Joanna and Helena talked about their good memories of Elisa, Joanna felt that something had shifted. The silence between them felt less heavy, as if there was finally room for the love that had always existed, but had never been fully expressed. Joanna wrote in her journal, "Today, I realized that secrets only have power as long as they remain hidden. When we shine a light on what lies in the shadows, we find space for forgiveness, understanding, and above all, love." After weeks immersed in Elisa's journal and conversations with her mother, Joanna began to grasp the depth of the secret that had silenced generations of her family. The pages she read carried words heavy with emotion, but also enigmas that pointed to a specific event, something that connected Elisa, Armando, and Helena in a way she still didn't fully understand. That morning, Joanna came across a passage in the journal that made her pause. "Helena will never know how difficult it was. I loved my daughter more than anything, but there was also something about Armando that I couldn't let go of. It wasn't a simple love, nor a permitted one, but it was real. And in the end, I had to choose what to protect, my daughter or him." Joanna reread the words several times, feeling the intensity of the dilemma her grandmother had faced. For the first time, she understood that the secret wasn't just about Armando or Helena, but about a choice that had marked them all. With the journal in hand, Joanna returned to her mother's house. She found Helena in the living room, organizing a pile of old photo albums. "Mom, I need you to read this," Joanna said, handing her the journal open to the passage she had found. Helena hesitated before taking the notebook. As she read, her expression changed, shifting from curiosity to sadness. "She knew that I felt it," Helena said softly. "She knew I thought she chose him over me. But you read what she wrote," Joanna said, sitting beside her mother. "She never stopped loving you, Mom. She just didn't know how to handle everything at once." Helena closed the journal and looked at Joanna, her eyes glistening with tears. "I always knew she and Armando had something. I saw the looks, the hidden smiles. But I never imagined she had to choose between us." Helena took a deep breath before beginning to speak, as if she were finally ready to unearth her own memories. "When I was 12, I overheard a conversation between my mother and Armando. He said he wanted to run away, that the life he was living was a prison. And my mother, she seemed torn. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I think he wanted her to go with him." Joanna listened closely, feeling the intensity of her mother's words. "But she didn't go," Helena continued. "She stayed, and after that she changed. She never spoke about him again. But she was never the same with me either. Maybe she stayed because she loved you," Joanna suggested. But the weight of the choice hurt her so much that she didn't know how to show it. Helena nodded, thoughtful. "I wish I had understood that sooner." Back in Anna's office, Joanna shared these revelations. "I feel like my mother is finally starting to understand what happened, but there's still so much weight in this story. It's like my grandmother's choice left wounds that never fully healed." Anna rearranged the pieces on the board, placing Elisa between Helena and Armando, and moving Joanna closer to Helena. "What do you feel looking at this?" Anna asked. "I feel that my mother and grandmother were more connected than they realized, but the pain of the choice pushed them apart. And I feel like it's my turn now to help reconnect them, even if my grandmother isn't here anymore." Anna smiled softly. "You're shining light on a bond that was obscured by silence. That's a powerful form of healing." That night, Helena called Joanna to the garden. Under the starry sky, she held a photo album that seemed far too old to revisit. "I want to show you something," Helena said, opening the album to the last page. It was a photo of Elisa and Armando together, smiling on a sunny day. Behind them, Helena, still a child, held a balloon. "That was the last day we spent together," Helena said, with a wistful smile. "I never understood why she kept this photo, but now I think I do." She wanted to remember that, despite everything, we were happy, even if just for a moment. Joanna looked at the photo and felt a wave of emotion. For the first time, it seemed like her mother was allowing herself to see her grandmother's relationship with Armando through a new lens. "She loved you, Mom," Joanna said, holding Helena's hand. "And I think now you can start to accept that." Later, as Joanna wrote in her journal, she felt a lightness she had never experienced before. For the first time, it seemed that the silence marking her family was being replaced by understanding and love. "Today, I realized that healing begins when we choose to see others beyond their pain. My grandmother lived through a difficult choice. My mother carried its wounds, and now together, we're rebuilding the story with compassion. This is the start of something new." After finding Elisa's letter, Helena finally seemed ready to face the past. Her mother's plea for forgiveness had touched something deep within her, but had also left lingering questions unanswered. As she reread Elisa's words, Helena looked at Joanna and said, "Armando, he's the only one who can tell us the truth now. If he's still alive, we need to find him." Joanna nodded, surprised by her mother's sudden determination. "Let's do this, Mom. Let's find Armando." Joanna and Helena began searching for clues about Armando's whereabouts. They combed through old documents called family acquaintances, but it seemed that time had erased almost all traces of him. It was then that Helena remembered a conversation from decades ago. He once mentioned having relatives in a small town inland. That might be a place to start. With little information, they headed toward the town. During the journey, Helena seemed thoughtful, as if preparing herself for what they might find. When they arrived, they began asking about Armando. Some people vaguely remembered a man by that name, but no one knew for certain where he was. After hours of searching, they found a woman who seemed to recognize the name. "Armando? Yes, he lived here a few years ago, but I heard he moved to the capital. He was a very private man." Although it wasn't the definitive answer they were seeking, it was a new lead. Back in the capital, Joanna conducted a more detailed search using the new information. After hours of calls and visits, they found someone who claimed to know Armando, a neighbor who gave them an address. The next day, Joanna and Helena stood before a modest house. "Are you ready for this, Mom?" Joanna asked, holding Helena's hand. Helena took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know, but we need to do this." They knocked on the door, and an elderly man opened it. His eyes were tired, but there was an intensity in them that Joanna immediately recognized. "Armando?" Helena asked, almost in a whisper. The man was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Yes. Who are you?" "I'm Helena," she said. "Elisa's daughter." The name seemed to disarm Armando. He opened the door fully, inviting them inside. The interior of the house was simple but well kept. Armando led them to the living room and sat down with difficulty, as if the weight of years and memories had weakened him. "I never expected to hear that name again," he said with a sigh. "Elisa was an incredible woman. Why did you disappear?" Helena asked, her voice filled with emotion. Armando looked at her, his eyes filled with something that seemed like regret. "Because I had to choose between what I wanted and what was right. I loved your mother, Helena, but I was a married man with a family that depended on me. And Elisa would never let me abandon that responsibility. She was strong like that." Helena sat in silence, processing his words. Joanna intervened. "But what about the secret? What happened between you two that made my grandmother carry so much weight?" Armando hesitated before answering. "Your father, Helena. He got involved in something dangerous before he died. Debts, shady business. When he passed, the people he owed money to came after Elisa. I used my connections to protect her, but that came at a price. She had to sell the family home, and I was the one who arranged it." Helena's eyes widened. "So it was you. You're the one who took our house." "I didn't take anything. Armando replied firmly but without anger. I did what was necessary to keep you both safe. But your mother could never bring herself to tell you, because she knew you wouldn't understand. Helena stood up, pacing the room as if trying to absorb everything she had just heard. I spent years thinking my mother chose you over me, that she trusted you more. And now I find out she was trying to protect me and our family. She loved you more than anything, Armando said, his voice steady. But she was also proud. She never wanted you to know she needed help. That was her way of protecting you. Helena began to cry, finally allowing the emotions she had carried for decades to surface. I blamed her for so long. I never should have done that. Joanna approached and hugged her mother. She knew, Mom. She knew you loved her, even if you couldn't say it to each other. Before leaving, Helena looked at Armando one last time. You made difficult choices, but thank you for helping my mother, she said sincerely. Armando nodded, moved. I made mistakes too, Helena. But if I can give you anything now, it's this. Your mother never chose anyone over you. That night back at home, Helena seemed lighter. She placed Elisa's journal on the special shelf she had prepared and said to Joanna, I feel like I'm finally starting to understand my mother. Not just what she did, but why. Joanna wrote in her journal, Today, I learned that the truth doesn't solve everything, but it creates space for forgiveness. My mother is finding peace, and so am I. And maybe that's all we need. The days following the session with Anna brought a new kind of routine for Helena and Joanna. It wasn't as if everything was resolved, but there was a deeper understanding between mother and daughter. The silence that had once seemed insurmountable was now replaced by honest conversations, and at times, even shared laughter. But while Joanna felt that the past was finally settling into its place, Helena seemed restless, as if something was still waiting to happen. One night, as Joanna prepared dinner, Helena walked into the kitchen with a pensive look. Joanna, can I talk to you? She asked, sitting at the table. Of course, Mom. What is it? Helena took a deep breath before answering. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About Mom, about Armando, about us. And I've realized that, for the first time in years, I feel like I have room for something new. Joanna set the spoon aside, intrigued. What do you mean by that? I want to travel, Helena replied, with a timid smile. I want to see places I've never seen. Live experiences I never thought I could have. I think Mom would have liked that. Joanna smiled, touched. I think she would be very proud of you, Mom. Where do you want to go? Helena shrugged, but there was a sparkle in her eyes that Joanna hadn't seen in a long time. I don't know yet. Maybe Italy, or somewhere sunny like Greece. I want to rediscover the world, Joanna. After that conversation, Joanna began to see her mother in a new light. Helena, who had always seemed so tied to the past, was now opening herself up to the future in a way that inspired Joanna to do the same. During a session with Anna, Joanna talked about this transformation. My mother is finally allowing herself to live, and it makes me think, maybe I need to look at the future differently too. Anna smiled, adjusting the pieces on the board. And what does that mean for you, Joanna? What do you want to build from now on? Joanna was silent for a moment before responding. I want something that connects me but also challenges me. I want to find my own path, just like my mother is doing now. The following week, as Joanna and Helena sat together having coffee, Helena brought up an idea that caught Joanna completely off guard. Why don't you come with me on this trip? Helena asked casually. Joanna nearly choked on her coffee. What? You want me to go with you? Yes, Helena replied with a smile. I think it would be good for both of us. A way to start something new together. And then if you want, you can follow your own path. Joanna was thoughtful. The idea was tempting, but also intimidating. I'll think about it, Mom. In the days that followed, Joanna reflected on her mother's proposal. She knew the trip could be a unique opportunity to deepen their bond even further. but she also felt the need to start carving out an independent path for herself. The night before Helena planned to buy the tickets, Joanna called her for a conversation. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about your proposal, and I think you should go alone." Helena looked at her daughter, surprised but not hurt. "Are you sure about that?" "I am," Joanna replied with a smile. "I think this trip is something you need to do for yourself. And while you're doing that, I want to start building something for myself here." Helena held her daughter's hand moved. "You're right. This is my journey, but I'm going to miss you." "I'll miss you too, Mom," Joanna said. "But I think this will be good for both of us." On the day of the trip, Joanna took Helena to the airport. As they waited for boarding, Helena held her daughter's hand and said, "Thank you for helping me get here, Joanna. For everything." Joanna smiled, holding back tears. "You did the same for me, Mom. Now it's time for us to live our lives, but always leaving room for each other." When Helena passed through the gates, Joanna felt a mix of longing and pride. She knew her mother was starting a new chapter, and that inspired her to do the same. That night, as Joanna wrote in her journal, she felt more connected to herself than ever before. "Today I realized that love is not about holding on but about letting go. My mother is living what she always deserved, and now I want to discover what's in store for me. The past taught us to love, and the future invites us to live." The reunion with Armando brought unexpected clarity to Helena and Joanna. For the first time, the silence that had marked Elisa's story seemed to finally have a voice. But despite the truth coming to light, Helena still carried a mix of emotions. She understood that grasping Elisa's choices was a crucial step, but transforming that understanding into peace would take more time and effort. The next morning, Helena sat on the couch, Elisa's journal in her lap. Joanna entered the room and saw her mother flipping through the pages with a distant look. "Mom, how are you feeling after yesterday?" Joanna asked, sitting beside her. Helena took a deep breath before responding, relieved in a way, but also sad. "For so long, I thought my mother had pushed me aside, and now I see she was trying to protect me, but that silence separated us." Joanna held her mother's hand. "You both did the best you could with what you had, Mom. But now you have the chance to do things differently, to turn this into something new." Helena looked at her daughter, a timid smile forming. "You're right, and I think I know how to start." Helena decided it was time to revisit the old family house, the place Elisa had sold to protect them. Though the house no longer belonged to the family, Helena felt she needed to see it to close that chapter. Joanna accompanied her, curious and emotional. When they arrived, they stood outside the gate, looking at the now renovated house. "This is where we used to play," said Helena, pointing to the garden. "My mother loved tending to the flowers. She always said they were stronger than they looked." Joanna looked at her mother, sensing the depth of the memories she was sharing. "She left this place because she knew you were more important," said Joanna. "And I think she knew you were stronger than you seemed." Helena smiled, tears in her eyes. Maybe she was right. Later, back at home, Helena picked up a sheet of paper and began to write. Joanna watched from a distance, respecting her mother's space, but feeling something profound was happening. When Helena finished, she handed the letter to Joanna. "You can read it. I want you to know what I would say to her if I could." Joanna read the letter silently. "Dear Mom, today, I finally understand the choices you made. I know it was never easy, and that you carried so much more than you ever shared with me. For so long, I thought you had pushed me aside, but now I see that everything you did was out of love. I forgive you, Mom, for not saying what you felt, for protecting me when I needed it, even if I didn't know it. And I hope you can forgive me too, for holding on to so much resentment for so long. With eternal love, Helena. Joanna held her mother's hand moved. "This is beautiful, Mom. And I think somehow she knows this now." In the weeks that followed, Helena began to open up more about her memories of Elisa. She and Joanna spent afternoons looking through photos, organizing old belongings, and sharing stories that had once seemed unreachable. "Mom was always a strong woman," said Helena during one of those afternoons. "But I think she never realized she could be vulnerable too. And maybe now you're showing that it's possible to be both," replied Joanna, smiling. Helena nodded, feeling the weight of decades of silence finally begin to lift. Joanna and Helena decided to attend a joint session with Anna to solidify the progress they had made together. Anna arranged the pieces on the board, placing Elisa next to Helena and Joanna. "I want you to look at this setup. What do you feel?" Helena took a deep breath before answering. "I feel like she's closer to me now, like we're finally on the same side." Joanna smiled, adding, "I feel like we're continuing something she started, but in a more open, honest way." Anna nodded, moving the pieces closer together. "This is what we call generational healing. You're transforming the stories you inherited so that future generations can live more freely." That night, as Joanna wrote in her journal, she felt a peace she had never experienced before. "Today I realized that love isn't perfect, but it's resilient. My mother and I are building something that once seemed impossible. A relationship based on understanding, forgiveness, and the choice to move forward. My grandmother began this story, and now it's up to us to continue it." In her room, Helena held Elisa's journal. For the first time, the weight of the words felt lighter, replaced by a sense of connection and gratitude. Helena had been away for weeks, sending photos of breathtaking landscapes and messages overflowing with enthusiasm. Joanna, on the other hand, felt a mix of longing and renewal. The distance brought a perspective she hadn't expected, a growing sense of independence with each passing day. Although Helena's journey was becoming a rebirth for her, Joanna knew that her own transformation was still just beginning. On a quiet afternoon, Joanna returned to Anna's office for a final session. She sat across from the therapist, who smiled warmly at her. "So Joanna, what have you brought for today?" Anna asked. Joanna took a deep breath, holding a notebook in her hands. "I've been writing about everything that happened, about my mother, my grandmother, even about Armando. And I realized there's something I want to do with all of this." Anna leaned forward, slightly intrigued. "And what is that?" "I want to write their story, to tell how silence can shape generations, but also how love can heal. I think this might help others who are living through similar stories." Anna smiled, symbolically moving a piece on the board. "That's powerful, Joanna. It's a way of transforming pain into something that can light the way for others. And how do you feel about making this decision?" "I feel like I'm finally creating something that's mine, but that also honors everything my mother and grandmother went through," Joanna replied, her eyes shining. Later, while writing in her notebook, Joanna received a call from Helena. "Hi, sweetie," Helena said, her voice full of excitement. "You won't believe what happened today." Joanna laughed, already used to her mother's enthusiasm. "What is it now, Mom?" "I met a group of people at a winery. They invited me to dinner, and I ended up telling them our story. It felt so good to talk about it, Joanna. I felt so connected, like Mom was right there with me." Joanna smiled, moved. "That's incredible, Mom. It sounds like you're living exactly what you've always deserved." "And you?" Helena asked. "How are things going there?" "I'm doing well, Mom. Actually, I decided I'm going to write a book about our story. I want to share what we've learned with others." Helena was silent for a moment before responding, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Joanna. I think your grandmother would be, too." A few days later, as Joanna reviewed her notes, she received a message from Helena, saying she was coming home earlier than planned. When Joanna went to pick her up at the airport, she was surprised to see her mother with an even brighter glow in her eyes. "Why did you come back early, Mom?" Joanna asked, curious. Because I realized that what I want most now is to be close to you, Helena replied. Traveling was incredible, but nothing compares to the feeling of being home, with the people I love. That night, Helena and Joanna decided to prepare a special dinner to celebrate everything they had experienced. As they chopped vegetables together, they laughed and shared stories, as if a new chapter was already beginning. Did you know Mom loved to cook? Helena said, smiling. I always thought I hadn't inherited that from her. But maybe I inherited more than I thought. You have so much of her in you, Mom, Joanna replied. And I think now you're finally seeing that. Helena looked at her daughter, emotional. And you have so much of both of us, Joanna. I'm so happy to see you building something so beautiful. After dinner, as Joanna wrote in her notebook, she reflected on the journey she and her mother had traveled together. Today, I realized that life is a web of stories, and each one shapes us in ways we don't always understand at the time. My grandmother lived through difficult choices. My mother carried the weight of them, and I had the chance to transform it into something new. We are not defined by the past alone, but by what we choose to do with it. And now we are choosing to live. In the living room, Helena flipped through Elisa's journal one last time, before placing it on the special shelf they had created together. With a smile on her face, she felt that finally she had found peace. The next morning, Joanna and Helena decided to walk through the park where they used to stroll years ago. Among the trees and the sound of birds, they realized that the journey they had begun was not just about the past, but about the future they were building together. And for the first time, they both felt truly free.